Okay, again, welcome everybody to today's Holding Hope Connect session for March 25th and on debunking words like enabling, boundaries, and codependency. For those of you that haven't met me or don't know me, I'm Antoinette Gravel-Willette, and I am the Stronger Together Canada Program Coordinator. With us today is Tyla Savard, and Tyla is Acting Director of Operations for Stronger Together and also Stronger Together Canada Program Manager. And I am just going to change my screen as it's recording. So today's session, as I mentioned, will be recorded. You will not be on screen. Only the three of us that you can see are on screen. If you would like to change your name in the chat, feel free to do so. And the recording will be posted to the Mom Stop the Harm YouTube channel next week. And in case you haven't found that, it's simple, easy to find. Go to YouTube and type in Mom Stop the Harm. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, and then we will move into a few of the things for today. So, and I would also encourage, and I know some of you are already doing it, putting where you're from and which treaty you are, and welcoming each other to today's call. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let's take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to care for the lands and to strengthen relationships between nations and to improve our own understandings of local Indigenous peoples, their unique histories, homelands, languages, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs, and how we can move forward in a respectful and meaningful spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And I just wanted to throw in that I'm joining from Treaty 2 territory. So just a little bit about the Stronger Together program. There we have Stronger Together BC, which is funded primarily from the government of BC, and we have Stronger Together Canada, which funding comes from Health Canada, SUOP grant, substance use and addictions. And the programming is we have Holding Hope and Healing Hearts. Holding Hope are programs that support people that have loved ones struggling with problematic substance use, and Healing Hearts are for those who have had a loved one pass due to substance-related deaths. And our Holding Hope Connects, what we're doing today, and we also have Hearts Connect sessions that we do. Today we've invited Dr. Ken Carpenter to come and join us, and the reason we've invited Ken to come today is he's done some work with our Holding Hope facilitators through Stronger Together Canada and really provides a unique lens that I so appreciate because it brings compassion and kindness with evidence together. And I invited him today because so often we hear those terms being misused and I asked him today to bring to shine some light, really, and to bring some more understanding on that specific area. Again, like I said, put your questions in. Ken is going to present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions after that. And Tyla is going to be monitoring our chat, and then if there's any questions, Tyler will throw them into the Q&A box so we can make sure that we capture everybody's questions in case. So that's kind of my spiel. And so welcome, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Ken Carpenter. He is the Director of Training and a board member of Center for Motivation for Change out of New York. Kenneth Carpenter is a PhD and licensed clinical psychologist and research scientist with over 20 years of experience developing, implementing, and evaluating evidence-based motivational and cognitive behavioral strategies for helping individuals make important lifestyle changes. Dr. Carpenter earned his degree from Hofstra University and completed a 3-year postdoctoral research fellowship in the psychiatric Epidemiology of Columbia University. I'll back up. Of the Psychiatric Epidemiology Research Training Program at the St. Joseph's Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. He has received federal and private foundation grant money for investigating the psychological, behavioral, and neurobiological factors associated with substance misuse and its treatment. Dr. Carpenter is the Director of Training at CMC Foundation for Change, a not-for-profit organization with the mission of improving and dissemination of evidence-based ideas and strategies to professionals and loved ones of persons struggling with substance use through the Invitation to Change approach. CMC Foundation for Change and Dr. Carpenter have developed a unique approach for families, blending components of CRAFT, MI, which is motivational interviewing, and ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, together into the Invitation to Change approach, an accessible set of understandings and practices that empower families to remain engaged and effective in helping their loved ones, their struggling loved ones. The approach has been widely used across the country and is utilized in trainings with lay people and professionals. Dr. Carpenter also holds an academic appointment at the Columbia University's Department of Psychiatry and is in research scientist in the Division of Substance Use Disorders at New York State Psychiatric Institute. He's also a member of Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. He's also the co-author of the Beyond Addiction Workbook for Families and Friends, Evidence-Based Skills to Help a Loved One Make Positive Change. Okay, that's a whole lot. So welcome, and take it away, Ken.
Well, thank you for sitting through all of that, everyone, and so appreciate the collaborative efforts I've had the opportunity with Antoinette over the years, and Tyler and organization, and thank you all for just making space in your day to attend. Really, my talk is going to be collaborative efforts that I've had over the course of years with families, and working together to find just a helpful set of lenses and understandings to bring out and put out into the world different ways of supporting our loved ones that have often found to not find their way out in the world. And hopefully today I can touch on some of those ideas, put them out there as things we can think about, and certainly open up the door for conversation. So my journey today with you all will be to touch on some of these ideas that we've brought up that have been helpful, that could be helpful, and perhaps can provide a useful compass for people who are journeying in their life to support their loved ones and themselves. And you have the chat and the Q&A, and I've got Tyler and Antoinette here, I so appreciate. So that's a way to get your questions and ideas there so we can pick up and learn from each other. So thank you all for being here. Now, this is different for me, as I've seen, because we're trying the webinar approach and I'm used to seeing people. So I'm speaking to all of you, not seeing all of you. Hopefully my pacing will be okay. And again, if you have questions between the chat and the Q&A, that's your avenue to be heard and bring your voice to it. So let me jump to slides and we'll go through some of these. And the slides really are just a way, hopefully, to put some words to the things I'll be talking about as well. And let me share my screen. Okay. So as Antoinette so nicely read just some of my journeying in my professional life, and I'm also a dad of two boys, so I wear a hat of parenthood, and as we were talking before, all the different hats we wear just can make life challenging in a lot of different ways. My collaborative efforts with families over the last 10 years has been this idea of the Invitation to Change approach, and my colleagues at the Foundation for Change and trying to do what psychologists and people in my profession have probably not done such a great job of, is getting things off of bookshelves and out into the world where they can have an impact. So I hope to touch on ideas that have been around for a while, often sit in research journals or on bookshelves and somehow get drowned out with other narratives that are out in the world. So hopefully this shines a little light on that work in a way that could be helpful to you all. And we do kind of think of it as science and kindness. And what I'll be building on as I talk is there is a lot of science of kindness out there that doesn't necessarily get its spotlight or highlighted the way that it could be. And yet what we'd like to say from the scientific world of behavioral science, there are some things that can be really useful when we think about our journey and supporting loved ones. And yet what we want to keep the kind of context on is relationships. I mean, it's in the context of relationships that all of this science really comes to life and thoughtfulness. So relationships are at the core of the things I'll be talking about. And that doesn't mean to help a loved one, you necessarily have to put your relationship to the side. And that's where kindness is also captured. This is a busy looking slide, but my intentions here is just probably saying something that you all know already in the bigger context. Right? All of the things I'll be talking about are in this bigger context of the world, where if we just think about substance use and the struggles of and the impactfulness of substance use in the world, it impacts a lot of lives. This is from this statistics from the Canadian Center on Substance Use and Addiction website. The years vary, but certainly the highlights here. Alcohol still remains to be one of the most common substances used in the Canadian population. It has gone up over the last decade. And 15% of all Canadians are still perhaps involved in alcohol use that's above what they would consider to be low risk. So it's impactful. It's still there. And 15% of any big country's population is a notable number of individuals. And certainly that's led to continued emergency room visits and other medical problems as a result of that. And I say that too because I know opioid use and fentanyl and the headlines capture really scary things and really impactful things, and not to lose sight of that at all. And in that context, even that second bullet point, that hospitalizations for heart attacks and the impact of alcohol and other substances far exceeds all the other ones combined, all the other substances combined. So it's just impacting a lot of lives, as you all know. Statistics on cannabis use going up, opioid toxicity deaths since the mid 2016 onward has certainly skyrocketed. And even we're seeing an uprise in stimulant use as well. That hasn't gone away and still is making its way and impacting a lot of lives. So just want to acknowledge this touches a lot of lives, a lot of families, and you probably walk down your block and knock on someone's or your neighbor's doors and you're seeing families that are impacted. Yet we know the experience of families, even though it touches so many families, and you would think that there's a commonality of shared experience that could bring people together. Society doesn't necessarily facilitate that. And often the narratives and the experiences of families are quite different. This is something to be feel shame about. Families being given the message that they're causing the problem. They're not fixing it. They're not doing enough, or the things that they're doing are making it worse. And certainly that wearing the parental hat, the responsibility that comes with that parental role, stepping into it, and all the fraught kind of judgments that can be passed on parents just by having that role, that message that families are experiencing, that somehow if a child or a loved one struggling, that's something about you as a parent. And that runs deep, that scars, that leaves deep footprints on the experience of families. And not only is it blame, but we can think too about the stigma and embarrassment that comes from families, that drives families underground, to not seek help or to kind of bunker down and protect themselves by isolating. And even on the intellectual level, parents, family members can think, yeah, they're not really responsible, but yet when you create space to talk, there still can be experiences of feeling shame and embarrassment anyway. And this is often what, again, is the outcome of shame and stigma, is isolation, withdrawing from families, withdrawing from community, withdrawing from social support systems that are critical, because they're embedded in relationships, and relationships are, I want to say, the power in which change can happen and support can happen. But that's not the effect net of the shame and stigma that's out there. And it creates a lot of barriers for families and for those that are struggling. And I can say, if we turn a light onto my colleagues, when I wear that hat as a treatment professional, we like to think as treatment professionals, we step above that. That is a field. We provide structure and support and scaffolding that can be helpful to families. Yet again, the feedback is that that's not necessarily the case, and there's a lot of room for improvement. Family members can feel just as judged and unsympathetic by sitting with health professionals. They often report feeling not heard or listened to, or worse, excluded from the decision processes. That idea of the relationship being asked to be put on the sideline, and treatment providers not leveraging and collaborating in a way that can be really useful. And that leads to hopelessness, to clinical feedback. Families are leaving, there's nothing they can do, that somehow they're on the sideline. And again, minimizes the importance of relationships and opens up experiences that the narratives I'm hoping we can think differently about, that sometimes are predominantly the ones that are floating out there in the world. So in that context, we know many lives are touched. We know that the helping profession doesn't always help facilitate the scaffolding and the support, and there could be a much better job for that. My colleagues and I are trying to bring into the discussion a different way of collaborating with families, to have them think about how they can go about supporting themselves and others on this journey in a way that can counteract some of that shame and stigma and experiences that people have in society, in the bigger picture, in communities, and even in the smaller domain of professional interactions. So we've pulled together a whole bunch of ideas that are evidence-based. We call it the ITC, and really it's a helping model, not something that should be just only accessible to professionals, but really if we can push into it, it's really just a set of lenses and ideas that talk about the human condition. And humanness is one thing we all share. And at that level, there's a connection that, and I do say, Antoinette read all the different things I've kind of been involved in. And but I do like to tell people, even all that kind of fancy academic stuff, none of that has helped lift me out of the human condition. At the end of the day, even with all that kind of thoughts, I'm still a human. And as a human, when I'm sitting with other individuals, there are challenges that just come with being human. And we can start there. Well, what does science tell us about how we can stay human and still try to meet the challenges and asks of life as we journey? And that's really where the ITC is coming from. It's a compassionate-based approach, and it's going to be based on the science and evidence-based principles that you can look in the science behind motivation, understanding why behaviors are there and what motivates human behaviors, which that set of lenses can open up different pathways for understanding and helping. Behavioral reinforcement, and I'll touch on that, but just the bottom line, what strengthens behaviors? What is it that motivates? And reinforcement is such a key dimension here, not only for understanding behavior, but also is how do you provide scaffolding that allows a relationship to empower individuals to change and stay connected. And certainly the science of communication and self-compassion, all different fields that have been around for a while and are so critically helpful when we think about the power of relationships and connection in helping journey in this human condition. Our combination of all of these ideas of science behind motivation and self-compassion and behavioral science and reinforcement communication is really a relational approach to helping. And this relational approach that I'll just touch on as a way to bring to light the discussion points is really kind of based on three core ideas that when we're in a relational approach to helping, there's an important part to understanding the process and the things that we see. Particularly if my helping role is I want to support a loved one, understanding and trying to make sense of this process is really an important starting point. It's an anchoring point. And we'll talk about helping with understanding. And that's going to capture this idea of behaviors making sense. One size doesn't fit all. And the important thing about ambivalence in change. When it comes to taking on the helping role, people talk about self-care, talk about supporting. But at the same time, right, being helper, using and taking a relational approach means as helpers and our humanness is something important to consider. And we'll talk about this idea of awareness and self-awareness, the importance of values and one's values as being the compass of how relational approaches can be helpful. And really this sometimes word that everyone shuns and runs away for, but we do put out, the practice of self-compassion. How do we sit with ourselves? How do we listen to ourselves? How in those moments as a person do we bring our presence to ourselves in our journey the way we would to others? And often self-compassion is something that's just falls to the wayside in really difficult circumstances. And then the behavioral science and the communication. Antoinette was mentioned about craft and MI, and these are all approaches that are based on the science of behavior and science of communication, which can be really helpful in terms of a relational approach to helping. So this idea of helping with action really is to the extent we can think about how we're communicating, how we're responding to our loved ones, and to bring a thoughtful, intentional approach to that can open up doorways and paths that allow for helping to be sculpted in a way that allows alignment for each family's values in a way that they want to be present, which is really, really important and not always in the messaging out there. So I'm going to touch on these. I hope it's food for thought. I hope it raises questions and just has you thinking about how potentially this could be helpful to you, and then we can talk more about it. So let's kind of just start with the first idea of helping with understanding. And behaviors make sense. And I'm going to just present some statements that capture the intention here for the time that we have. And this idea that if using substance or substance use was just about touching a hot stove, the people that would be involved, our loved ones, they would have stopped already. And what we mean is, while often our language can put distance or label a loved one's behavior, where we start and where we're coming in the science is that substance use can serve a purpose. There's a why behind it. And often it's that why or the curiosity that gets lost in a lot of the conversations. Some of it because it's certainly scary. It's certainly hard to see someone struggling that we love. And sometimes it can be hard to make sense of behaviors when it seems to be mixed up with a lot of things, particularly things that also can look really hurtful and scary for an individual and cause pain for individuals. And we don't want to lose sight of that. But we also want to invite this idea that someone's investment in the behavior is just a sign that it's serving a purpose for someone? Can we understand the why behind the what? And it's an invitation just to understand what someone may be getting from that particular activity or substance use. And sometimes people say, well, that means, do I have to condone it or not? And it's not. We want to step away from that language, but say it's a curiosity to say, can I see you and understand what this is doing for you? If I can at least start to understand that, it starts to open up doors and conversations for what change and the process of change would have to entail. Now, as a behavioral scientist, I hear my colleagues talk about dopamine and brain work and all these other things that can be in the cultural narratives and context. And what I want to kind of propose is when you push into all of that, what everyone's trying to figure out is what makes something reinforcing to an individual. Right? The neurochemistry of reinforcement involves dopamine. So that's what the dopamine people are trying to figure out. What makes this reinforcing? We propose it in the first step in a helping model is that curiosity. Can I help see your behavior by understanding what it's doing for you? Could we have that? And that conversation often is missing, and it's an invitation to think about it. Do I see my loved ones draw to this? Can I help understand it? And the communication strategies I'll be talking about certainly open up doors for that. But a key anchoring point here is that as humans, all our behaviors make sense, even when they seem to not make sense. And that sounds counterintuitive, but they make sense from the lenses of they serve a purpose. And they're reinforced. And that cuts across all activities, even those that can seem puzzling to understand from a distance. Well, Ken, if you're having me think about being curious and trying to understand behaviors, what my loved one may be getting from them, what purpose do they serve? Is it taking away anxiety? Is it helping with other struggles? Is it making someone feel more connected to things in their life? Does it make them feel less physically ill? All these kind of different things that can come up. It kind of invites this other idea of understanding, which is the why behind behaviors can be quite different for different people. One person may be using a substance to deal with crippling anxiety. Another person may be using a substance because it makes them feel socially connected. There are two different motivations going on, two different things, but that starts to push on this idea of one size does not fit all. Often the language we get, particular language that labels things, reduce everybody to a single fit. It makes everybody, or the narrative, that they're all alike. And what the downside to that is, it seems like it can simplify it. The downside is we lose the nuance and the individual understanding we need to understand our loved ones or understand the individuals we want to help fully. And it's that individuality, that uniqueness in their particular why struggles that allows for supportive approaches to become more powerful. So I would like to propose this understanding in the idea that one size does not fit all, that each person is different, each loved one is different. So even when we think about substance use and the pathways in and the pathways out can be quite different for each individual. And the hopefulness there is that for one person's journey may look different than another's. That doesn't mean one person necessarily is on the wrong path. It just opens up this idea that there can be different paths for different individuals, and that we can find and help find the right path for different individuals. And that the reasons behind that are really important. So back to that curiosity, people's whys a critically and important set of lenses to start thinking about how to step in and in a relational way support loved ones trying to make change. If the reasons for people's behaviors are quite different, and there are different ways in and different ways out, and we make room for that variability, then change may not be a linear or either or option. And here's a critical kind of concept that we think about. And I like to propose one thing that the behavior of science implies, but isn't really spoken about much, is the idea that change comes by addition. And I'd like everyone to just kind of think about that. Often we can think that, well, if I'm making a change, I'm getting rid of my old behaviors. I'm unlearning things I no longer want to do. And I often ask people to think, for those that know how to ride a bicycle, I'd ask for a set of hands here. But if I really, for those that know how to ride a bicycle, if I said somehow there was a message saying that bicycle riding was now bad for you, something that you shouldn't be doing, that you should really go and get rid of. If I told you I had, as a psychologist, a program that can help you unlearn how to ride a bike, make you forget how to ride a bike, would you believe that I could actually do that? Somehow make you unlearn something you've spent time and effort doing. And our language in change can also bring us to that belief that change is through subtraction. But what I like to propose, and often behavioral science says, that change really is a process of learning new things on top of the things we've already learned. It's not unlearning something, it's learning something new on top of older behaviors. And that process brings in this idea of ambivalence, which means even when I have new behaviors, I can have conflicting motivations. I can have old behaviors and new behaviors talking to me. I can have challenges of learning new behaviors when sometimes the older behaviors say, yeah, but you're better at that. You've practiced that more. And all of that gives this rise to this concept, and motivational interviewing really put it out there, that when we set out to change, quite often, we can get caught in this tug of war of ambivalence. I want to move in a new direction, and yet the call of old behaviors can remind me of the use of my old behaviors. And that can be a tug of war. And what that means is often change can look like a bit of a back and forth. Wanting to change, taking steps towards new things, and also older behaviors coming back. And that doesn't mean there's backsliding. That doesn't mean that things aren't necessarily working. It just means it's part of the human process of change. And when we think about, and if you've heard about motivational interviewing, the whole core of motivational interviewing is really inviting counselors when they were learning. How do you sit and help people who are struggling with ambivalence? And the evidence in the old days, when I say old, was, well, you should kind of plow through ambivalence, tell people this is what they need to do. Don't allow for ambivalence, right? Harder language, hit ambivalence head on, a toughness. And what the evidence started showing is counselors who were taking that approach, their individuals they were trying to help were doing much worse over time than counselors that were sitting and allowing for ambivalence and using communication skills to help people sort through the tug of war. Not in a shaming way, but in a way like, yeah, that can be a really tough thing about change. So how do we help individuals govern that? And when we make room for ambivalence, it just allows for different conversations and a different stance in our relationships when we see loved ones have ambivalence. But it is a function of being human. And I highlight that because even as helpers, we can feel ambivalent ourselves as human beings. We can be in a space where we notice a tug of war in things that we want to change or do differently, but then find old behaviors there. So this understanding of reinforcement, that one size doesn't fit all, that change can be filled with ambivalence and a back and forth. And it's in the process of working through ambivalence that often is the biggest chunk of the change process. It has been very insightful and allows for relationships, the kindness to be infused in there. That how can a relationship work with someone to help them sort through their ambivalence? Now, nothing I'm saying is easy, even when we bring a curious approach and try to understand loved ones and realize that there are different pathways in or out. And when we see people struggling and loved ones struggling with ambivalence, that makes an easy experience. It's challenging as a helper to be in a relational space supporting loved ones who are struggling there. Which brings this idea of how do we turn that helping lens or awareness onto ourselves if we're going to use our relationships and our relational interactions in a way to support loved ones and staying connected. We have emotions too. We're human. And we can't somehow step out of humanness. So the first part is this invitation of self-awareness. Often as helpers, we can lose sight of ourselves because we're focused on the struggles of loved ones. And that's for good reason, because we care. And there are things that can be scary and concerning, and it's hard to see people struggle and be in pain. But at the cost of that awareness, if we lose sight of awareness, we lose sight of our experiences, our emotional space, how well we're doing, how it's impacting our ability to be present in the way we want. So self-awareness is a practice, not a switch. It comes and goes. It's taking time out to check in and just saying, what am I feeling in this moment? What do I notice about myself in this moment? Where am I being pulled? Am I being pulled towards the way I want to be? Or can I at least acknowledge right now I'm being pulled away from the stance or the way I want to be? Not as a sign of weakness, but a sign of humanness. And that self-awareness is just a critical first step. If I can't check in with myself, I'll lose sight of where I'm at, which impacts how I'm going to be present for my loved one. And all of this is critically important if I want to stay connected to what's important to me and to my loved one. But we want to use self-awareness in a very helpful kind of way. And it's not just to be self-aware for self-awareness sake. One thing that we talk with, and I invite us to think about, that helping really is bringing of the why behind our helpingness, our relationships. If I start to become self-aware, I can start to come back and think about what's important to me in this relationship. What are my values? When I step into this relationship with my loved one as a parent, as a sibling, as an aunt, as an uncle, as a caring person, how do I want to be present? What drifts me from the kind of person I want to be in this relationship? But when I think about the kind of person I want to be in this relationship, what are those qualities? If I can practice and find them and keep them on my horizon, I have a little bit of a lighthouse, because we know life can get stormy and we can be stuck in storminess and very difficult circumstances. But if I can start to use my self-awareness and flesh out these values, my values become that lighthouse. I can try to always orient to that. And that doesn't mean finding my values is always means I doesn't come along with difficult thoughts and emotions. And that's what this idea of willingness is really the core of. And the practice of self-awareness, that when I step into these relationships and I step towards my values, Can I at least I know I have to make room for the difficult things that might show up for me. I want to stay connected to my loved one. And I know at times when I do that, I'm really, really scared. And I can experience how that feels. So the invitation of willingness is staying connected to my loved one, in a sense. Is it in the service of, is the scariness I experience in the service of my values? And that's just always a question that each family can think of in terms of theirs. And often our narratives lose sight that each family, each person is allowed to think about their values and think about how they want to be present in that way with their loved one and the challenges that they face. And our discussions can focus and include that as part of the conversation. So we don't need to ask you to leave your values at the door. Bring them with you. That is part of the relational space that can be so powerful. If I allow myself to tune in to what I'm experiencing and bring awareness to my humanness, if I am allowed to talk with someone, to think about my values as a parent, as a helper, as a person, and have permission, so to speak, to make that my kind of guiding compass. Self-compassion is embedded in all of that. And this word often, and working and talking to families too, can be fraught with a lot of traps. I feel selfish if I'm compassionate to myself. How can I make time for myself when my loved one is struggling so much and there are so many things I need to attend to? It just seems cheap to take care of myself when there's all these pressing issues. So I'd like to, when we think about self-compassion and the science of self-compassion, we introduce it as a practice. And it starts with just this question: when I'm sitting with myself, when I'm struggling, am I offering myself the advice, the care, the presence that sometimes I so readily offer others in my life who are struggling? Or do I treat myself differently when I'm struggling compared to how I treat others? Because often there's a big difference. People will talk about how readily they can give themselves to others who are struggling. But when it comes to sitting with ourselves, our voices are much more critical and judging and blaming than any other voice that we would use in supporting others. So self-compassion is the active practice of supporting ourselves as we most likely are supporting others. And it's just got three components. One is embracing our humanness. It's from that aspect that connects us to the greater supportive communities. Doesn't mean pampering. It means making sure I can find my values, that I don't allow the chatter and critical voice in my head to be the one that supposedly owns the truth of me, to recognize some of that self-talk that isn't helpful, and to be able to come back to what's important to me and support myself in my humanness. And we put that as a practice because it's not an easy thing to do, and often something we don't get a lot of practice in, but critically important in building a relational aspect, because it's how we're relating to ourselves, which is an important part of how we relate to others. But we can think about self-compassion. And why am I taking care of myself if I'm supporting my loved one? And there's a lot of narratives, and sometimes we hear words about codependency. So I just want to position this word differently, because if we talk about self-awareness, if we talk about us as being human beings when we help and fully embracing our humanness, codependency often is a term that's floating out there, excludes a lot about what we know in the science of humanness. And the term, often the way it's used, is upheld or supported by this belief that my emotional life shouldn't be dependent on those I care about. Somehow, that if I'm a balanced human being, I should be able to distance my emotional life from what my loved ones are engaging in, what they are struggling with, and that I have distance from that. But if we think about, well, Ken, what does the science say about human connection and relationships? And what the research time and time again has built over time, and that's ignored often in there, is that we are dependent on everybody. Our emotional well-being, our emotional responses are synchronized with those that we love and those that we're in relationships with. So often outside of the world of substance use, codependency is not a bad thing. It's actually a given that we are emotionally in tune with those we love. So it's not a bad thing or something that should be shameful or that somehow we're wrong for doing. It first acknowledges, as a human being in a connected relationship, my emotional responding will be tied to the emotional responding of my loved ones. That's what comes with being connected. That's what becomes as part of meaningful relationships. So the question isn't to stop being that. It comes back to self-awareness, is how can I build awareness of my own emotional experiences, make room for them, understand my emotional responding in my important relationships, and practice how to navigate my emotional life. I can make room for feeling hurt and anxiety when my loved one is struggling. Why? Because I'm connected to them. That's a human response. If I'm aware and practice self-awareness, I can embrace the fact that my emotional life is going to be responsive to the emotional lives of my loved ones. So how can I bring awareness to think about how I want to step into this relationship, my relational space, and practice my own emotional awareness and self-compassion? Not because it's a bad thing that I'm doing, but it's because I'm a human being who's connected in a relational life. Unfortunately, I think the idea of connectedness and emotional bonding and the emotional lives of relationships has gotten lost in the narrative and often has been something that we can blame ourselves for or being told or think that we're doing something wrong. But we are talking about relational worlds. And if we're going to use relational space and relationships, that by all means, that sense of connecting, it means I'm emotionally tied to those that I care about. So how can I just build that awareness to how I want to step towards my values and helping? And that's just practice. The key idea here is nothing is we're experts at, but we can make room for practice. Loved ones changing and struggling. The change process is practicing. Living is practicing. So practice is just a key component to allowing space to start to practice that curiosity, sitting differently with ambivalence, practicing self-compassion and self-care. And some days it comes easier than others, but that's okay. Practice is the critical ingredient in change and bringing differences into life. It's the bringing of new behaviors on top of older behaviors. I know I'm doing kind of light touches here, and I hope you get an idea of if we're building this foundation of understanding, bringing a curiosity, understanding the motivation behind behavior and how that complicates change and how ambivalence can be normal. Process of changing and the idea of self-awareness and connectedness. And what comes with connectedness is our emotional connections that are responsive in relationships. And that's not a bad thing. It's a function of being connected and practicing. A lot of the nuts and bolts of the invitation to change approach talking about are just the communication skills that are embedded in motivational interviewing, how we can think about having helpful conversations that are invitations to encourage people to talk, to open up. Relational frameworks for helping is in the context of this relationship. Can I make room so that you can tell me more about what's going on? So it helps inform me about how I want to respond and step in to be of help based on my values and based on the way I want to be seen and present. Often communication is one of the first casualties in difficult circumstances. And once people stop talking and communicating, and yet different opportunities that they're there, the power of relationships start to diminish because that sense of connection starts to erode. So if we're no longer talking or hearing each other, we're distancing, we're moving away. And that can just undermine some of the power that's there. You might say, Ken, okay, communication, we can understand that. We can think about self-awareness and values, and all right, maybe there's a different set of lenses we may be able to bring to understand this. And you started off with this idea that behaviors make sense because the anchoring point is reinforcement is the water that strengthens behaviors. It's the process by which we add new behaviors into our behavioral garden. Behaviors grow and get stronger because they're reinforced. So often in the conversation or the narratives that are out there, the narratives have taken on an angle that says reinforcement is actually one of the worst things you can do to help someone who's trying to change or someone who's struggling. That the things that have to be done are the things that we're told get rid of behaviors, that make behaviors go away. And if we just work to get behaviors to go away, then we can get back to our relationship and get back to strengthening those. And the science of behavior says something that's kind of been really impactful over time, which is, if we can't erase behaviors, the task becomes how do we help people bring new behaviors into their life so that they become the better option for people. The option that helps people connect with is important. So that gets lost. Often the message is don't do anything that's going to reinforce loved ones. Do everything that's going to squelch or punish behavior. So positive reinforcement becomes the message of you're doing something wrong if you're staying connected to your loved one, or you're trying to support some things that they're doing throughout the process of change. So positive reinforcement as a helping strategy is just something else some people are made to feel bad about or confused about. Am I doing this? Am I doing something wrong? And it's a real confusion, and that makes sense given the narratives that are out there. And how does that confusion show up in our words? Well, I don't know if people have heard of the word enabling out there. It's been part of the culture. Don't enable, and worse yet, don't be an enabler, right? Those are very dangerous things that we are told. So I went back and I said, well, what do we really mean by enable? So I just wanted to throw this out to you. The history of the word going way back is to put in to empower, right? So the word is, how do you help empower people? How do you help create a scaffolding for people to take certain action? giving people the means to do something. Right? So I think about that. And I've been thinking a lot about this word, even in my role as a parent. I actually think that's been my biggest ask, is to be an enabler. And what I mean by that is there's nothing in the word by itself. The word just means, how do you help people move in a particular direction and empower them? Right? So let's hold that for a second, because seen through the lens of reinforcement, it means, how do you help people make something possible? Versus the cultural messaging of a person who encourages or enables negative or self-destructive behavior in another. But notice how the definition has narrowed over time. It's gone from, how do I help empower people to make something possible, to, if you're doing this, you're doing something wrong. So what I'd like to propose is, can we have a nuanced or different way of thinking about this? If helping change and building relationships is about empowering, supporting, helping others make things possible, the question isn't being an enabler versus not. The question just becomes, what are the things that I'd like to make possible for my loved one? And if I bring intentional and I'm allowed to talk about that for my values, the question just becomes, how can I go about supporting the activities that I'd like to support for my loved one? And stay connected and use my relational space to do that. That nuance has been often lost, and unfortunately, I think, has made things very confusing when it comes to the idea of staying connected and reinforcing and using my relationship to support my loved one. Because the counter narrative is, you're doing something wrong for that. And this idea of reinforcement also has us rethinking this idea of rock bottom. And when we think about this in the cultural language, often comes from the idea that motivation to change comes exclusively from pain and aversive experiences. That is the only way people are motivated to make differences in their lives and to make changes, from the pain of their experiences, which isn't necessarily true. People make long-term change because they're moving towards things that they value and they want. They're moving towards the things that are meaningful to them. They're not just moving away from things that they don't want to experience. But the idea is, if the only way you're going to change is by moving away from painful things, it starts to position our ideas differently about the change process. And it's also based on the belief that once people have enough motivation to change, that the switch is thrown and now they're off to the races and they're just going to move. So rock bottom says they just got to get to the point where they'll feel motivated to change, and then they'll change. And yet that totally misses the idea of ambivalence. Change is a process. Change is about adding new things over time and practicing that. And it allows for the idea that some days we're more motivated than others as human beings. It's not a bad thing. It's just part of the change process. So how do we build scaffolding to help support the change voice over time? And it removes positive reinforcement as influencing motivation over time. As I said critically before, this nuanced approach that if I'm building scaffolding in the context of my relationship, it's about watering and trying to build and use a relationship for support. And it's actually the positive reinforcement and supportive part of relationships that are the long-term ingredients for change. And rock bottom has taken that out of the equation and taken away the dynamic process of motivation and ambivalence. So, do people want to move away from pain as human beings? Sure. Do people make changes just because of that? Usually not. People stay and make changes over the long term because they're moving towards things, not away from things. And again, sometimes these terms can lose sight of that and take away the signs that we're developing. So what I'd like to just kind of put out there and leave the discussion is that there's total room for relationships and connectedness. It is a critical ingredient in the change process, even in this world, scary world at times, of loved ones struggling with substance use. And if we're going to allow for relationships and connectedness, all it invites us to think about is how we could see the behavior from a different set of lenses. That motivation lies behind it. There's a why behind that people change and have different whys. And that ambivalence is part of our human aspect of the change process. And awareness and values are critically important, as well as treating ourselves and practicing ourselves compassionately. And the narratives have stripped often a lot of the behavioral science and the kindness of what it's like to be able to stay connected, be thoughtful about reinforcement and communication, and leverage the power of relationships to help support loved ones in the change process. And it's all based too on practice. So hopefully this has just raised some thoughts and ideas. And Antoinette, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you. I know for me, there was lots of different things that kind of jumped out, and I made some notes for myself. And just wanted to open up. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, so we'll just go to those. One person said, in motivational interviewing, how do you move beyond being given the answers they think you want to hear in response to what would you like to be doing in a few years, and really engage?
Well, it's a great question. And I think in conversations, I think said the answers that they want to give. And it's really points to the importance of the idea of trust over time, right? And that can be really something that's built often. And of course, relationships, the types of relationships are important, but often when I hear the answer that I feel someone thinks I want to hear, I understand that, and it comes from that behaviors make sense. There's a reason why someone's offering that, usually because they've had many conversations where they've experienced they have to say the right thing. And that's where they step into initially. So moving past that, often I could say, I appreciate you saying that, and I'm still curious. Are there other ideas that you have in there? I'm not sure if you feel that I want a particular answer. I might say that. I don't know if you're feeling like I want to hear something. But if we took that off the table, and I'm really saying I'm really just curious in what your thoughts are. No agenda, can I try to start to invite you in to test the water? And that's often the process. They'll test the water. Can I say something and see if you're really going to allow me to say that? And it's a process. So I appreciate that question, because I think motivational interviewing, the difference between someone talking to someone for the first time versus not, is they're not exactly sure what your agenda is. And they got to start feeling like, because motivational interviewing ultimately is telling the person, this is about your agenda, not mine. And sometimes that takes time for people actually to believe.
That's a really good point. It's about you mentioned it's about the relationship and the trust and the connection. And I really liked when you said enabling and changing the word to empowering, and so how do we empower people? That really, because that's really what we want to be doing, is empowering our loved ones. I'm just going to go to the next question that we have here. I have tried to maintain a loving relationship with our daughter, and then in brackets, who has mental health issues as well as substance use disorder, and lives in our home in her own area. In order to facilitate change, her criticism and rage towards me has reached a crossroads in that I find it hard to be around her. How do I turn this around?
And that's I so appreciate that. Nothing I wanted to put out there says that it's easy or always so straightforward. So I want to kind of distinguish two things, because as human beings, our minds can go down two roads. We can go down the outcome road, which often my mind is saying, am I getting the outcome I want? Okay. There's nothing, it's not a bad thing. I can notice that, like, if I'm doing this, I'm trying to act lovingly towards you. And all I'm feel that's still happening here is your rage towards me, your criticism of me, your continued avoidance of me. So my outcome mind can be saying, nothing is working here. Lovingness isn't working here, because the outcome is my loved one's not responding the way I would like. And that makes total sense, because we would like to be able to have, we have visions of the relationships between people that we'd like to have. So we can make room for that and say, yes, that's what I would like to have. And this other ask or other mind, sometimes we could think of as just the process. And this gets challenging. But given the way my loved one is acting, this is back to that values. How do I want to be present so that my actions are just exemplifying lovingness? And that's a little different, because that's saying I can step into my values as a choice, and I'm not going to always make them embedded on the outcome. So how would that look differently? You're yelling at me. I know I have a value of patience. That's the way I want to be. That's just my value, say, for argument's sake. And I'm in your presence and you're screaming at me and you're saying really hurtful things. If I was going to act lovingly here, how could I bring that into the moment? That could be me not yelling and saying, I value talking with you, but right now I don't feel this conversation is being helpful, so I'm just going to step back. But look forward to when we can come at it at a different time. Okay? I'm acting lovingly. That may not necessarily give me the outcome, but I'm bringing that to my actions. And I'm also saying, this is kind of where I'm at. Or being patient, you're arguing with me. Okay. I am going to practice listening skills here. So my value is just being patient in this moment. I choose to do that. So I'll listen a little bit longer and then try to come back in and have a different conversation, maybe vocalize, again, reflect that back. I mean, we didn't go into all the skills, but it sounds like you're really angry today. You're really upset. So I can bring lovingness in how I'm using my communication skills to interact. So I appreciate that. There's all nuance to it. But the lovingness, when we think about awareness and values, I always come back to this question is, and it's hard because I may be sitting there having all kinds of emotional responding to what you're engaging in this moment, because I'm human. Can I find that lighthouse in my emotional responding? Can I just say, okay, how do I want to be in this moment? And let me just find that. And then use that as my compass. Not letting my outcome mind say I'm going to get this outcome. It comes more about my response. I don't know if that made sense. You can let me know. That's where this role of helper and values we want to put in, because that's critically that invitation that to stay connected to the way you want to be in these moments. Often the narratives are demanding that you have to be a certain way. I want to say, no, that's not necessarily the case. More important to feel, how do I want to be in that moment? Or step out. There's no right or wrong. It's all about how I want to be present on my terms.
I really think you said that really well. It's like, it's about how do I stay connected to my values in this, and and being responsive rather than reactive in the situation. So
Right.
it's like, how do we do that? Then go to another question. What are your ideas around using mindfulness practices to assist in the changes?
I'm like a total, I think that can be a powerful practice. And without, one thing I want to say with the science of everything, and that's why I think there's a lot of power in this, because you can run into a lot of these ideas in different ways. And self-compassion too, in the science behind that, has a mindfulness component. But I think it can be a useful way of bringing awareness to ourselves that gives us a little space to maneuver. And for those that do mindfulness practice, you probably have a running start on what it's like to slow down and just observe your mind in action. And for those that use mindfulness as a much bigger practice, the invitation all behind mindfulness is to bring awareness to our emotional responding. And practicing stepping back for a moment. Because often we can become reactionary and we listen to what our minds tell us in the moment, and we give our minds we give our minds the driver's seat. And mindfulness at its core is the practice of observing our reactions first before responding, which again, we never learn most of the time in life. It's a practice, but it can be really helpful. I think it's a big component of self-compassion, a big component of self-awareness, critically helpful as a tool in our relationships. And for our loved ones that are changing, mindfulness is also a very important tool for people trying to change habits. Because if we don't erase them, we know they can come up and talk to us. So how do you not let that voice always be the one that dictates what you do? And for people, by learning mindfulness, they can step outside of that practice and allows room for new behaviors to come in. So it's a really helpful tool. And if people are curious, by all means, I think it can be really helpful.
Thank you. I have a couple questions, and I think you've answered some, but I'm going to still bring them forward because these are questions that I had before. Is how do I stay in relationship with my loved one with their ups and their downs? And I think you've explained that, but I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
I think, yeah, that question one, realizing the ups and downs. So noticing there's the two components that I would put out. The curiosity can be an ally. That's one way of, if I can bring a curious mind to this, and that question of what's behind the ups and downs. What could be the why behind this behavior that I'm seeing? Even for the question that was raised before, if I'm receiving hard behavior to sit in the presence of, emotional behavior or anger or that, if I can step back and I say, well, okay, let me try to understand this. What's behind that? Why am I seeing this? Why is this behavior here right now? It can give me a little distance. It allows me to stay in the relationship because I'm just using a different set of lenses, not as look what they're doing to me, which certainly I'm receiving it and my emotions are going, but the curious helps me step out of that for a moment and say, there's something behind this. So I'm going to try to understand that. The other is the values. The question then, if we think about it in terms of that relationship, is how do I want to be present in the ups and downs my loved one is showing? What are my values here? How can I try to bring that into play? Not because it's a magic bullet and it's going to change you, but because this is about how I want to be and my values. This is how I want to be in this relationship with you. Knowing your ups and downs. So it is maintaining a relationship, your connection to values, and that's always something to be thoughtful about. And as an individual, it's our values. So they're ours, there's not a right or wrong in that. It's how do I want to be in this relationship?
Thank you. Okay, so have a couple other questions.
Mhm.
There was a point when you said you don't have to leave your values at the door. What if it's a devout religious family who believes their child's substance use is wrong and they believe in immediate abstinence?
Right. Yeah, that's well, that's a great point. I'm trying to think what hat would be the best way to wear that. I think the question then becomes not so much around values for that. And what I mean by that is I can see, if I'm sitting with a family, I can see you and your values. I hear your values. I can bring that same curiosity. How did you get those values? What's behind them? What highlights that particular road as being the only road based on your values? So I can try to understand it in a way that fully appreciates why that's the set of lenses, say, a religious family is using. And that's their option. I can also think about conversation, which is okay, and not in a judging way, but here's another curious way. How has that been working for you? In the sense as, do you feel connected? Are you, given what you're experiencing, in trying to be of help from that perspective? What's your experience been? Have you felt connected to your values as a parent? Has it given you the guidance that has been helpful? Has it yielded understandings that are helpful? So I can have an honor, because if someone came back and said, yes, that value has worked for us as a family, and here's how it has, then at least I can engage in this conversation about where it has and what have been some of the challenges with that particular road. And trying to open up the door for, if it's not working, if it's not helping, if they feel it's pulling them further away from the way they want to be, we can explore other roads. And I can still validate that that must be tough to hear. They're ambivalent. That's their ambivalence. They have a religious set of lenses that are saying change has to go this way. It's not yielded outcomes. They're hearing about other alternatives. So I can make room for their ambivalence and what it must be like to think that they're not sure which is the right way to go, or the way they think is the right way hasn't necessarily led them down the path they're hoping to go. The thing I want to be careful about, and I can say the evidence says X, Y, and Z, and depending on the discussion I'm having, and we all know as humans, if we feel our values are being threatened, we may actually double down on that and dig our heels in. So I can validate where your history brought you to that conclusion. And if we leave room for other perspectives by validating. I can open up doors for other conversations. I know that was very wordy. I apologize if that answer was more wordy than it needed to be.
Thank you. And I'm watching the time, and we have, I'm going to read the next two, and then we have one more question, and then we'll close for today, because the next two in the Q&A are kind of similar. So can you please give us a few examples on how to engage with our loved one for an appropriate boundary request? And then the second one, is there a place for the idea of family setting boundaries and limits in your practice?
I'll start with the second one and then come back to the first one on the example. I think, well, I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to put nuance to it. I think where boundaries and limits, the way I think about it and the way in the practice is sometimes they're used as I'm setting a limit or a boundary to control another person. So this is one way to have their behavior stop. So it's the intention. I'm setting this boundary as a way of controlling the behavior of another. I would also like to think about this in terms of I can operate in the world and in my relationships from my values. So if I'm using the word boundaries per se, they're more about my values, things that I'm willing to support and reinforce, or based on my values, things that I won't go along with or do. But that's values-based responding. And so there is room for an example. If my value is respectful communication, I can be in a conversation. And if I notice this conversation is drifting away from those values because there's yelling, there's screaming, there's what I perceive as disrespectful interactions, then I know that's a communication that's not consistent with the values I have. So I can inform the person I'm talking with, which is, and this goes to surf skills and other things if you want. How can I communicate I enjoy our conversations. I find them helpful. Shouting and cursing is something that I just don't value. It's not the kind of conversations that I personally want to be involved in. So when I see the conversation going in that way, I'm just going to step out of them. And I'd love to come back around and let's have this conversation when we both can engage in a different tone. Now, some might say, well, you set a limit there, Ken. You put a boundary there around conversations. And okay, that's conversation. I look at it as I'm just communicating to other people my values and where I'm willing to go and where I'm not willing to go. And I'm going to just communicate with my individuals in a respectful way and let them know this is where I'm at. So I think to both those questions, the way boundaries and limits are talked about, yes, there's room to act from your values, communicate that to individuals in your life and relationships, and you have permission to be able to let others know where you don't want to drift away from your values and put it out there in a signaling way. And that's a different kind of stance than I'm setting a boundary on your behavior because I don't like what you do. There's just a nuance to it. And I think I try to bring it back to values. And that's by all means value-driven behavior.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And our last question, and I'm just watching time here. My son has been suffering with the effects of severe consequences of his stimulant abuse, long periods of incarceration, overdoses, etc. His stimulant abuse brings him to a very angry and aggressive state at times. I'm good at not reacting when he's directing it towards me, and I distance myself from the de-stress by not engaging in phone calls or contact when it starts up. I'm not good at gauging how long to disengage when the cycle begins. Also, my son has been in probably 20 different programs. He's good at first, but then doesn't seem to work the program and usually leaves or gets discharged prematurely after about a month. I don't know how to support him so that his restlessness doesn't take over.
Right. And I think not on the distancing, the relational aspect, it's an important point. I know that one size doesn't fit all is a lot of the nuance in kind of observing the data you do get from relations and your loved ones, and trying to gauge when is, what responses do I provide? When are they most helpful? When do I seem to get feedback that they're not? And just there's an ongoing process of trying to calibrate and change. And I know that can be different for different people. That can be different for the same person, depending where they are over time. But I think some of the relational aspect is, as in relationships, we know a lot about the people that we're in relationships with. There's a wisdom there, an important wisdom in knowing the rhythm of others and being able to use that knowledge and wisdom and the rhythm of others and the rhythm of our relationships. That can be helpful in just thinking through how I want to step into that moment. When is it time to say, for my values, I'm going to be present differently, but in a way that still relates to the way I want to be. So I think the nuance of the question is important, which is, where is he? What's the signals I'm seeing, and what are my values, and where am I at? And all thinking that through, and hopefully thinking that through in a supportive way, because that's often the conversations I have with people. Let's go through and just think out loud. What do you notice? What do you have? Let's go back to your values. What's important? Let's just think about the way you want to be here and build there. As far as working, I know the program and the support and the scaffolding, highlights just this process of change, and that one size for people's roads into and out can look quite different and have different timelines. And that important question, what is the useful scaffolding to help my loved one work through their ambivalence, find traction in their change process in a way that's meaningful to them, so that they're moving towards something versus just moving away? And that goes back to that question, helping families think out loud about what's the scaffolding that works for you. How can we think about the scaffolding that could potentially be helpful to your loved one with the challenges that they have? What would the reinforcement be like? What would the things that I would want to bring to help empower them? Right back to that. What are the things that I'm willing to do to empower their recovery or empower their change process? What are some of the things that maybe I would want to just be more intentional about, or less intentional? So that conversational space is really, and that can be different for each family, each loved one.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to thank everybody for today and for coming and for all of your questions. And especially I want to thank you, Ken, for all the work that you do and for bringing bringing up, all the different lenses and looking at the ambivalence and looking at our values and how does that all fit together. And I'm just going to take it back a little bit to when you started. It's about being human and about how we are all human and how, just to come from that compassionate response and also to have that compassion for ourselves as we navigate things and possibly go, I know I've definitely done it more than once. Gee, that did not go the way I wanted it to go. And I need to do a retake on this with my loved one and doing my, my self-compassion piece. So, yeah, I just want to, thank you so much for all the work that you do and that you continue to do, Ken. And I just want to put in a little bit of a plug for, again, I know Tyler's been keeping up in the chat. For those of you that are still kind of asking questions, this will be available on our YouTube channel. And and definitely because it's going to be open, we want to share this with people. We want to get the word out that, there's a different way to engage with our loved ones and be with them. And so absolutely, please share that. Holding Hope does have a virtual conference coming up on April 20th and 21st. And I know Tyler was putting the websites in the chat. And also on May the 6th, we're going to be having another Connect session with Benjamin Perrin, talking about from crime and punishment to compassion and evidence-based. And, you can definitely look up Benjamin Perrin. His most recent book is Overdose, Heartbreak, and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis. So just a few things that are coming up. So take care, everybody. And I see lots of, thanks and accolades in the chat coming through for everything. So thank you so much. And everybody have a fantastic rest of your Sunday. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Antoinette and Tyler. Appreciate this. Thank you.